We're going to give 1 minute because only one person has joined us back. So it's hopefully the others can do it. It's okay. That's second one. That's good. Anyway, I can start introducing that acoustic here is so bad. The Hudson River School, and I have a big specialist there in front of me, so I have to be very careful. Because I'm really talking about a region that I have never visited. I've looked at pictures, but never visited it. So anyway, this is a movement that started in the mid-19th century and literally embodies a group of landscape painters that are led by Thomas Cole, who was the founder of the movement, and is very heavily influenced by Romanticism. We've talked about Romanticism before, and if you remember when we looked through the German movement and the British movement and so on, that all starts with that idea of the sublime, really making nature, transcending nature almost to look at a higher goal, which is very often very religious. Really looking at nature as being their creation, perfect creation by God. And so very typically at the very beginning of the Hudson River School, Thomas Cole and Durong and so on followed that path and see further than nature, see the hand of God in the creation. And so when they look at the nature, they always make it look even more beautiful and grander than what it actually is. And we will see, we will be able to look at pictures compared to the paintings to see that and understand that thing. So let's look at, and hopefully this, yes, it works. So we have here a map that gives us an idea of the Hudson River Valley that comes all the way from, starts in Quebec and goes down at from the Lake Champlain and goes down to the US. And this is the marvel about the US, and we have to try to put our feet in their moccasin, if we can say, and try to understand how they discovered that nature, where you didn't have these great expanses in Europe anymore, because Europe was building up so rapidly that you didn't have these great acreage of beautiful nature, and still wild. And that was the big thing. It was kind of feeling that you were in a primitive land, and it was wonderful. So the river is about 315 miles long, finds its source in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York and flows through the Hudson Valley and finally drains into the Atlantic Ocean between New York City and Jersey City. And so what we will see mostly is really stay a lot into the Catskill Park and Catskill, the Catskill Fall. Look at, of course, the middle Hudson Valley and all the way down. So the Hudson River is named after Henry Hudson, an Englishman that was sailing for the Dutch East India Company, who explored it in 1609. And of course, the Dutch East India Company is one of the two big trading companies that were founded in the new Dutch Republic and were incredibly instrumental in giving the wealth to the Netherlands, that's a very young country at the time. The river was called Taoatea, the river, by the Iroquois, and as, and forgive my pronunciation, Muekunnetuk, river that flows two ways by the Mohican tribe, who formerly inhabited both banks. It was named Rio San Antonio by the Portuguese explorer Esteban Gomes, who explored it in 1525. And then it was first named by the Dutch Rio de Montagne, formed by the spine of the Dutch colony of New Netherland, later called the Noordrivier, which is the North River in Dutch, the Delaware. The Delaware River being known as the Zuidrivier, the South River. So Hudson and the Delaware. Other occasional name, Manhattan's Riviere from the Manhattan River, Grote Rivier, large river, and the Grote Mauritser Rivier, the Great Maurice Rivier, because Maurice was the stadhouder at that time in the Netherlands, and so they gave the name to it. And we see on the right a view of the discovery of the Hudson River by Albert Bierstadt on the right. The colony that's named was conceived as a private business venture to explore the North American fur trade. During its first decades, the New Netherlands was settled rather slowly, partially as a result of policy mismanagement by the Dutch West India Company, and partially as a result of conflicts with the Native American. As you know, the Lower Manhattan was built, and what we know as Wall Street, literally a wall that was protecting the Dutch that were on the east side against the natives that were on the west side. But as you can see on that map, and I don't know how well you can read, so where we have the Manhattan place. We have, so the new Amsterdam is here, but we have all around New Belgica, New France, also is New Sweden at the south. So there were all little plots that were settled by some population, and they immediately accapated it and said, this is New Sweden, this is New France, this is New Belgium, this is New Amsterdam. But definitely the Dutch were the one that took the best of it, if you want, and really settled for quite a while. The settlement of New Sweden encroached on its southern flank, while its northern border was redrawn to accommodate an expanding New England. So you see, that's the only name that remained. So I gave you a few names there. The New Netherlands had as governor Peter Minuit from 1626 to 38, Willem Kieft from 38 to 47, and then Peter Stuyvesant, that you're much more familiar with because of the cigarette, between 1647 and 64. So finally, during the 1650, the colony really grew up quite a bit and became a major port for trade in the North Atlantic. Then the English came and they really wanted to take over that place. And so they surrendered, the Dutch surrendered Fort Amsterdam to England in 1664. And that surrendering was formalized in 1667, contributing to the Second Anglo-Dutch War. In 73, the Dutch retook the area, but then had to relinquish it under the Second Treaty of Westminster, ending the Third Anglo-Dutch War the next year. So Minuit is generally credited with orchestrating the purchase of Manhattan Island for the Dutch from the Native American called the Lenape, whereas Peter Stuyvesant was Director General of the New Netherland colony by the Dutch West India Company. What is interesting is to see how many US citizens are descending from these Dutch American. The Roosevelt family produced 2 presidents and are descended from Klaas van Roosevelt, who emigrated around 1650. The Van Buren family, who gave 1 president, Martin Van Buren, also originated in New Netherlands. And the Bush family, descendant from Flora Sheldon, are descendant from the Schuyler family. So we see that they had quite an impact on the politics of the United States as a whole. So let's look at really the influences on that Hudson River School. We have three main themes in America in the 19th century. We have, of course, discovery, exploration, and settlement. The influences, the artistic influence comes all the way to the 16th century, early 17th century, with Claude Lorrain, the French painter who had settled in Rome, and has had an incredible influence on most landscape, the classical understanding of landscapes. And we see actually with that painting by Cole, a definite influence by Lorrain with that framing with the tree, which was so typical of his. John Constable, of course, the early Romantic English painter. Turner, same thing, great Romantic English painter. And then the Düsseldorf School of Painting that attracted a lot of American painters, particularly landscapists. They would literally form a little cluster in Düsseldorf there and take these classes that were, whereas landscape, we have to realize in many academies were considered at the bottom of the hierarchy, but not at the Düsseldorf School of Painting, where they really emphasized the role of landscape painting as being quite a decorative thing, and then also, again, was following that Romantic movement. In literature, we have Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and then, of course, the great art critic Ruskin with modern painters. As far as their style, we can see in general, definitely they are naturalistic, they are idealized, and that comes together with the sublime. Sublime emphasize that grandeur of nature, and often is kind of on the side of idealizing the same. Sometimes there is a synthesis of different styles that is performed by one of the painters. And then they would go from sketches that were made with in situ, and would then paint, of course, the large paintings would be done in the studio. They didn't have, at that time yet, I mean, the little tube that you're accustomed to, were invented around 1812, but before it was commercialized, it took a little while, and in France, it didn't come really until 1845. So I think it's about the same with the early Hudson River School. They didn't have access to these easy portable tubes that would make painting in plein air quite easy. They still had to grind their pigments and had a little bladder of different pigments that they would carry with them, which wasn't too easy. Watercolor was something that they could do. They could sketch with watercolor in situ. As I typically do, I give you a timeline. It gives us a chance to understand where they stand in time. I left two names on top that are the British painters Constable and Turner. So we have an idea of where they stand compared to him, and also put John Trumbull, which is the previous generation, that is going to play quite a role in Thomas Cole's life, for example. So we can see that among that Durong is 5 years older than Thomas Cole, but he's going to flourish really as far as a landscape artist a little later than Thomas Cole, because he's going to be very much influenced by him. The names that we have at the bottom are the people that we're going to see in 2 weeks. The second generation with Kensett Church, Bierstadt, Catlin, and then Sanford Robinson Gifford. There's Hicks also, but he's so different, I'm not even mixing. We'll talk slightly about him later on. So Thomas Cole was born in 1801 in Bolton Le Moors in Lancashire, England. And he emigrated to the United States in 1818 with his family and went to Steubenville in Ohio. And that one I know, I went through many times. In 1822, he started working as a portrait painter and later on gradually shifted his focus to landscape. He moved to Philadelphia in 1823 and then to New York in 25. In 1826, he had befriended a person who became a patron of his that had bought 2 paintings of his, who was going to finance that trip up the Hudson River to the eastern Catskill Mountains. And he became one of the founding members of the National Academy of Design, also around that time. In 1827, he opened a studio at the farm called Cedar Grove in the town of Catskill, New York. And then from 1829 to 32, embarked on the grand tour of Europe to study the old masters, and particularly in Italy from 31 to 32. Then went back to Italy between 1841 and 42, particularly in Sicily. And I can understand that, it's one of my favorite places. And in 1848, died at Catskill at the young age of 47. He produced thousands of sketches of varying subject matters, and his most known pupil is Frederick Church, who we will see in 2 weeks. It is literally not until the War of 1812, when the frontier shifted far to the west, that the attitude changed and people started regarding the beautiful heights around the Hudson River Valley as something scenic rather than something ominous or fearsome. There were still people that were living there that could sometimes cause some big problems. In 1825, as I mentioned before, Cole sold 5 paintings to George W. Brune, who financed a summer trip to the Hudson Valley. And this is where Cole made most of his sketches for the great paintings that he painted later on. And so these paintings were typically featuring the Catskill Mountain, the Catskill Falls, the ruins of Fort Putnam, and then 2 views of Cold Springs that are also going to play a role in his life. Cole was quite interested in the whole story of that region. And he, for example, took a steamboat ride up the River Hudson and stopping at West Point, then going north to Catskill. The whole region became really a subject for painters, and literally formed then later on the Hudson River School. What is the Catskill Fall? It's a 2-stage waterfall of the Catskill Creek, located in the eastern Catskill Mountain. The waterfalls are one of these oldest American tourist attractions in that valley. They keep described by many, in many books, a lot of even travel books or essays and poems, and definitely was one of the main subjects because it was so dramatic for many painters. And we'll see in 2 weeks, we'll see other painters that will describe that beautiful fall. What happens is that when Cole came back, some of the paintings he made were reproduced on the front page of the New York Evening Post. And this really made the valley very known, very famous, and quite attractive. And very quickly, actually, some inns were built in these scenic places that allowed people to stay over for a journey. So here you see that you can really look at the difference between the view by Cole, and then the actual double fall of the Catskill. Here's another view. So they are in that cave that is under the fall. And so seen from under there, they see the fall falling in front of them. As I said, in 1824, already a tourist hotel was opened in the Catskill Mountain, about 100-mile upriver from New York, which was quite an adventure already. So when coming back to New York, he displayed 5 landscapes in the window of William Coleman's bookstore. And according to this, very quickly, some were purchased by Mr. Seton, who lent them to the American Academy of the Fine Arts annual exhibition in 1826. And that really made the name of Cole known. It attracted also the attention of John Trumbull, Asha Durong, that we'll see, and William Dunlap. And this really opened the gates of society for Thomas Cole. He was also befriended by William Cullen Bryant, who was a poet and a newspaper editor, and who actually wrote a sonnet to Cole when he departed on his grand tour. Here is just to show you one of the other works. This is an etching by Winslow Homer that shows ladies, and look at the way they're dressed and going down that slope to come close to the waterfall. It's quite wonderful. But of course, you had also quite the large expanse. This becomes kind of a more pastoral style, where you see the Catskill Creek and the distant Catskill Mountain. This is actually one of the largest and most ambitious painting by Cole of that area. And I think you can feel the affection of Cole for that landscape. It's really deeply felt. This is about the moment where Cole moved from New York City to Catskill, just the year before he painted this picture, in the midst of completing what is going to be the first big series he did, The Course of Empire. Unfortunately, modernity really damaged that beautiful, pristine landscape, because just before he began painting it, a railroad line was built through its very midst. So there you can see the mountain house that opened in 1824, just in the very middle of the Catskill Mountain. The title shows you that this is a morning time, and the fact that typically the people that were visiting that inn were routinely roused at daybreak so they could observe the sun rising over the Hudson River. So no sleeping late at that time. It's set on 300 acres of a high plateau. So you have there the high peak and round top to the right, and North and South Lake. As I mentioned, he went all the way to the Fort Ticonderoga from Jelina. Trumbull was very impressed by the work of of Cole, and immediately bought one of his paintings. So the Fort Ticonderoga, formerly Fort Carillon, is a large 18th century star fort built by the French at the Narrows near the south end of Lake Champlain in northern New York. It was constructed by Canadian-born French military engineer Michel Chartier de Lotbinière, a Marquis, between 1755 and 57 during the 7 Years' War, which is the same as the French-Indian War. Because it was of very high strategic importance, it kind of went from the French to the English and then to played a role during the American Revolutionary War. Yes, it's very difficult to see.
These two guys are fighting.
I think it's where you see these, that kind of smoke.
And these guys
really
are
far.
dueling,
Yeah.
maybe over a woman over here. Come on.
No, here they are. It's just to show two soldiers that are running in, probably French. But I think they're there because they're on the lake. And I can show you actually the earliest picture of it in 1850, which is a daguerreotype of the ruins, because by that time it was neglected and became a ruin. But then later on, in 1909, they restored the place and it has become quite an attraction. But it, as you can see by the walls, this is the star, what they call the star fort, because it has the shape of a star. So in 1785, the fort's lands became the property of the state of New York. And then the state donated the property to Columbia and Union colleges in 1803, which sold it to William Ferris Bell in 1820. It was at first used as the summer retreat, but then the completion of railroad and canals connecting to the area of New York brought a lot of tourists, and it was converted as a hotel to serve the tourist trade. And it's called the Pavilion, so the pavilion. As we know, he went to Italy, and that to him it opened a very different kind of landscapes, and sometimes extremely grand, especially if you go down to Naples and see the Vesuvio. So he first went to Rome in 1832, and he wrote, I love it, to his parents: "The things that affect me in Rome are the antiquities. None but those who can see the remains can form an idea of what ancient Rome was." And of course, Rome was not in good condition at that time, but the idea of suddenly facing these triumphal arches and the remnants of temples and the Colosseum and so on really marked him. And so this is going to be an influence, particularly on the series that we will see soon on the Empire, because it is really using part of the architecture that he had seen, but also he looks at aqueducts and the Roman countryside. So this is what he shows, a view near Tivoli, not too far. 1832, thank you. I do that from time to time. Sorry. Thank you. Fortunately, I have Stephen, otherwise I wouldn't. I'll correct it. This is another of these interesting paintings. So these are kind of fanciful landscape. This is where we get into the some more idealized work, but it's a very enigmatic work that not too many people can quite explain. And so that was made in 1832 and finished in 33, of that incredible fountain that is inspired probably by some that he saw in Florence or Rome. And actually, the artist himself inscribed the title on the back of the painting. So the Titan's goblet is the title by Cole, which is not always the case, by the way. Very often the titles are imposed by either people in a museum or by the collector. But in this case, we cannot discuss the choice. But it's quite interesting because it's so out of scale in a sense, that huge goblet at the front. So as I mentioned, he's going to make two big cycles in his life. The one here, the course of the empire, was done when Cole returned to America. And he continues to interpret the Italian landscape, particularly in this, which is a monumental allegory. It's made of 5 paintings, and I'm showing it to you the way that it was actually laid out according to Cole's diagram. So this is the way the paintings were set. It's actually quite interesting because it reflects the popular American sentiment of the times when many saw pastoralism as the ideal phase of human civilization. And they were fearing at that time, because America was growing so rapidly, they were fearing that the empire would lead to gluttony and inevitable decay, really looking very much at the Roman Empire and its demise. So these were designed to be displayed in the picture gallery on the 3rd floor of the mansion of his patron, Luman Reed, on Greenwich Street in New York City. So let's look at each of them. This is the Savage State that shows the valley from the shore opposite the crack in the dim light of stormy day. So we are on one side of this is the mouth of the river. And so we see that mountain, a big storm that is coming and is going to be pretty bad. But what we find is we see a hunter clad in skins. Is there. And he's hunting a deer that is going down there. So we have pretty much wilderness. We have canoes that are paddling up the river. And on the far shore, we can see a clearing with teepees and a fire. So definitely that visual reference is a Native American life. So this painting symbolizes the ideal state of the natural world. It is a healthy world, unchanged by mankind. Moving to the next one, we have the kind of more Arcadian, more Claude Lorrain type actually painting. The sky has cleared. We are in a fresh morning in a day of spring or summer. We have changed the viewpoint a little bit further down the river. We still see the crack, but also with the boulder, but we can also see the fork peak that can be seen in the distance beyond it, at the highest mountain there. Now, the wilderness has given way to settled lands with plowed fields and lawns quite visible. There are different activities, as you can see on the ground, with plowing, boat building, herding sheep, even dancing. And in the foreground, an old man, and it's almost like that early Greek idea of geometry, you know, when they were drawing on the floor. That old man sketches what may be a geometrical problem with a stick. But what is interesting is that we have that megalithic temple that is built there, that is quite reminiscent of Stonehenge when you see that. So you must have seen some sketches of Stonehenge. And you have smoke in the middle, which probably means that there are some sacrifices being made there. So what can we see there? An idealized pre-urban ancient Greece. And the work shows mankind at peace with nature. It symbolizes that the environment has been altered, but not so much that it or its inhabitants are in danger. So we're still in the very positive side. Big change to the third one. The third one, the consummation of empire, shifts the viewpoint to the opposite shore and about where we had the clearing with the teepees. It's noontide in a glorious summer day. On both sides of the river, we have now colonnades with marble structure, and the marble structure go all the way down to the river. The temple has been transformed into a huge dome structure that dominates the river bank. The mouth of the river is guarded by two pharos. You can see one here and the other one over there. These lighthouses, and then you have ships with triangular sails that go out, as you can see from the harbor. A lot of people, very joyous. They obviously entertain a lot. We have a beautiful bridge and people just feasting all around. And it seems to suggest that it's the Rome at its best. So decadence is seen in every detail of the cityscape that foreshadows the fall of that mighty civilization. And you can still see the crack on the right. Now, as we know, that doesn't last forever. And there comes the fourth one, which is destruction. About the same perspective as the third one, but this shows the sack and the destruction of the city. There is a big storm again at the horizon, but we also see a fleet of enemy that have overthrown the city. So you can see the enemies there, and population is trying to flee. The women are being raped, and you can see them falling from the building to try to flee the enemy. The bridge is broken, and what is a makeshift crossing is just sinking because of the weight of the people that are trying to cross. You have fire breaking out everywhere, and then you have that statue, that huge statue here in the foreground that posed like a Borghese warrior, stands there but headless, no more head, and still striding forward, as he says, towards an uncertain future. So the scene is probably suggested by the sack by the Vandals, sack of Rome by the Vandals in 455, which corresponds to the end of the demise of Rome. And so the conclusion of that series is desolation, that there's just the remain of the cities. Nature is growing onto the columns that are left standing. There is nobody anymore there. And it's really that very gloomy picture that shows that all empires, what can happen after they fall. It's a very difficult future where humanity has been destroyed by its own hands. So it's an interesting series, because you think of now where we are right now, and it kind of rings some bells. The idea of the history being a constant renewal. But here we are. So this is probably the biggest historical cycle then Cole made. But beside that series, he went on painting lots of a lot of landscapes, and this is probably its most famous, where he really, it's like a hymn to nature in the Hudson River, with the oxbow view for the Mount Holyoke. Holyoke, is that the way you pronounce it? Holyoke. This is not in the Hudson River Valley, but in Massachusetts. And so this is after a storm. And this is a really interesting painting because he juxtaposes the healthy side, the future, the civilized side. You see all these fields that are beautifully arranged and very clean, very well taken care of. And then he positions himself here on that little rock formation, painting quietly, where the storm is there, just very threatening. And the Oxbow formation is quite an incredible formation. And when you know its history, there he's still connected to the Connecticut River, but he will be blocked later on. So there we find the sublime and that idea of monumental landscape where it's emphasized by his point of view. On one side, you have two blasted trees that show that there's quite a bit of power in the elements. And then on the other side, as I mentioned, the fields that are neatly arranged. The sun is shining on one side and the storm is on the other. As the scholar is mentioning, he is an American producing American art in communion with American scenery. And that's what makes it so dear to people in this country. The Oxbow is here, you have some old pictures of the Oxbow. Was called originally Hockanum Bend. And it was directly connected to the river, but in 1840, some floodwaters cut through the narrow section, separating the Oxbow from the main river and the current. Around 1900, it was used extensively for logging operations as a holding area for the logs before they were sent down to the river. Then later on, and that I've seen an aerial picture, but didn't want to put it on, it was later cut to build the Interstate 91 that runs across the Oxbow. And it's still accessible to the Connecticut River by a channel. Other beautiful landscapes, the Notch of White Mountains, painted in 1839, is the steep and narrow gorge of the Saco River in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. The notch is at the upper or northern end of this gorge. This is, you almost feel that you are west of the country. This is such a huge landscape when you see it, but it's marvelous. I've been in these White Mountains in New Hampshire. They make some nice landscapes in the winter. And here you have a photograph of it. So at the same time, which is wonderful, you have the same coloring as the painting. He was at that time asked to make another series by another patron, The Voyage of Life. And this is a series that he's received a commission of in '39 by the prominent New York banker and philanthropist Samuel Ward Sr. And that's a series where he wants, it's again kind of an allegory, where he does, life is a pilgrimage. A person's life can be divided in 4 distinct stages, and the course of a person's life can be metaphorically compared to a journey on a river that winds its way through a magical landscape. And so he's going to have that idea of the river and then that little barge going down. And each painting is going to represent a stage of life. So the first one being, of course, childhood, where you see an angel protecting a child that is navigating all by himself beside the angel along the river. The second painting is youth, And you have a much more dynamic view already that young boy. And by that time, the angel is left on the shore and is sending him by himself, which is quite a metaphor also, as is now ready to go by himself.
I'm wondering what that structure is in the cloud.
And that's a good point. Do you know, Catherine?
No,
No. It must,
maybe it's idealism or something.
yes. It's the goal. It's like a huge. Yeah, it probably is a kind of a dream of the future. I'll have to find that out. I should have found that out before showing it to you. But
Looks like he's aiming for it.
yeah, exactly. That's
Well, yeah, when you're young, you want to get
absolutely. And then the third one, yeah, it's actually there for them. So the third one is manhood. And you can see that the barge is getting into white waters there. And so he's now facing really life and all its hurdles. Again, we have more tempestuous weather, which also is a metaphor for the difficulties in life. And the angel is far away. He's up on the left. Yeah, he's there. And then the last one is the voyage of life, old age. And the angel is coming closer. Now, during the time he was painting that series, his patron, Ward, died unexpectedly. And so he completed the paintings in 1840. And finally, because he had so many problems with Ward's heirs, he decided to paint a second copy of that series to make sure that they wouldn't disappear or be split. And so the second set is now at the National Gallery in Washington. He went back to Italy, as we mentioned. And here's a wonderful view of Mount Etna from Taormina, which is quite a privileged view of the volcano there, particularly with the ruins that you can see in Taormina, the theater and so on. So this would be an inspiration for anybody looking at it, and you can see that in the eyes of a painter. It must be a hard stopper, you know, when you see such a place.
That's snow.
Yes. In the winter, you do have snow on it. It's a high mountain. And of course, on the opposite side, if you go south, you have Catania, which is the city that's built at the foot of the Etna. But never on the flow. The lava flow never goes to Catania, fortunately. And then he went on just painting some beautiful places. This is a commission from the New York leather tanner Charles Loeb, the mountain fort that's based actually on a sketch that he had gathered during his trip to the Adirondack Mountains. He made so many sketches, he could go back and then paint it. Here, what you see is somebody, the typical lone traveler with his horse that's facing that wild nature. This was painted 2 years before his death. I think I'm going to finish it and we'll open to discussion. There's not too many one about Durong. So the next artist that I wanted to show you that has had quite an impact too, is one of the early early Hudson River painter, is Asha Brown Durong. He was born in Maplewood, New Jersey, which was at that time called Jefferson Village in 1796 and became an apprentice to an engraver between 1812 and 17. He actually engraved the Declaration of Independence for John Trumbull in 23. In the 30, he literally changed his style and his interest from engraving to oil painting. And in 37, he had befriended Thomas Cole and accompanied him on a sketching exhibition to Strome Lake in the Adirondack Mountains. In between 45 and 61, he became president of the National Academy of Design, and then published also in 1855 a series of letters on landscape painting, which codified the standard of idealized naturalism. And sorry for the not online, he died in Maplewood in 1886. He's a very interesting figure, also very mystical and very religious, looking at nature again from that religious point of view. Here is the famous Declaration of Independence that he engraved for Trumbull. That's really established his reputation as one of the finest engraver in the country. But then he turned to landscape, as we know, and his main interest becomes really the oil painting. He's encouraged by a patron, Lumen Reed, who is pushing him to do that. And he, as I mentioned, went on that exhibition in 37 with Thomas Cole. And then he spent summers sketching in the Catskills, in the Adirondacks and the White Mountains. He was an advocate of drawing directly from nature with as much realism as possible. So his sketches must have been very precise, and we'll see some at the end. So just like the other Hudson River School artist, Durong believed that nature was an ineffable manifestation of God. So this is one of things that he said in his letters. Let the artist scrupulously accept whatever nature presents him until he shall, in a degree, have become intimate with her infinity. Never let him profane her sacredness by a willful departure from truth. So, and I think more Durong than Cole is very much attached to that idea, but he might make it look grander, but the details are going to be very specific. The Indian's Vesper. So here is also, it's a commission for the American Art Union. And he's asked to paint for the institutional landscape, the subject and size to be left to his own choice. And he takes the opportunity. And so he shows that Indian with his arm raised to the sun in praise and based in that beautiful light along just below the tree. And you have that feeling, almost like Cole in that first series of the Empire, that you have that pristine nature there, that nobody has touched it, nobody has modified it. One of his most known painting is this one, the Kindred Spirit, that was painted in memory of Thomas Cole. It's dated 1 year after Cole's death. He shows Cole and the poet William Cullen Bryant, that I had mentioned before, standing on a rock over a ravine in the Catskill. And it's a moment where they have that communion with nature. The painting that was donated by Brian's daughter, Julia, to the New York Public Library during 1904 was sold by the library by means of Sotheby's at an auction during May 2005 to Alice Walton for a purpose $35 million. The sale was performed as a sealed first bid auction. So normally we're not sure of the amount, but this is pretty much what they believe, which would make it a record price paid for an American painting.
It is not in the private collection, is that crystal?
It's a, yes, this dates, and I should have corrected you, absolutely right. This dates from before Crystal Bridge was built. But it's one of the highlights of the museum. You see, the true province of landscape art is the representation of the work of God in the visible creation, where you see the stream in the wood, very typical of what he does, that framing with the tree and that vista all the way in the center, which corresponds a little bit to some of the Barbizon painter at this pretty much the same time in France. And we see the detail, his interest really in the detail, not only of the plants, but also of the rocks. It's less large expanse, but more detail of nature when you look at that. And particularly with this one, the rocky cliff. And people make a parallel between this work, for example, and what he was doing as an engraver. Was as an engraver, he had to look at things very much in detail to reproduce it. And so here it's almost like he uses nature as its board, and then he's copying it very much in detail. But scientific people look at this with a really scientific accuracy that corresponds to some development in science that happened at that time, where they started looking at rocks and understanding where they were coming from. Part of the prehistory, far prehistory, and where they started questioning the validity of the Christian creation compared to the actual history of the world. And so this is what they pretty much feel when they look at Durong, looking at that rock, which I think is a magnificent piece. So next time, as I mentioned, we're going to look at the second generation with church and Frederick Church. Let me see, Bierstadt, definitely Catlin, and others. So hopefully you have been able to base yourself in the East Coast mostly. And I'm at that time going to stop the recording and open the field to question, remarks, whatever you want to